Take a close around the world today. When the world is still paying attention to the war in Ukraine, everyone is asking the question, what measure should the international community to take in order to stop the ruthless behavior of Vladimir Putin? But meanwhile, in the midst of the war in Ukraine, one country somehow drew attention more than ever, which is China. Given the fact that there are 1.4 million Chinese people living in this country, and of course, geopolitically speaking, the younger generations today in China, not only they're changing the domestic policies, but also they're generating the international noises as well. However, in this episode, we don't need to talk about the younger generations, but we need to talk about the current leader of China, which is Xi Jinping. Since 2002, Xi Jinping became the new leader for this large country, starting from the Belt and Road Initiative all the way to Make China Great Again or Made in China 2025. And given this political and also this economic changes in China today, how should we understand this person? Some people say Xi Jinping is the new god of the country, but other people are saying that Xi Jinping is somehow what we call untouchable because of his political power. No, so that's why today we are going to dive into regarding this person, whether he's God or he is a real leader or he can be described for any other format. It's crucial that we talk about it today. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our special guest. It's Mr. Adrian Geiges. Now, as the Moscow correspondent of the German Spiegel TV, Adrian Geiges covered the military coup against Gorbachev, the end of the Soviet Union, and the beginning of the new Russia. In 1997, he lived in Hong Kong to report about the hard handover of the city of China. Of course, that if you know Adrian, I have to say that one of the most profound and amazing books that I read, and which is written by Adrian, is called Xi Jinping, the most powerful man in the world. And this book reached the top 20 of the bestseller list in Germany and has been released in English right now. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Mr. Adrian Geiges. Adrian, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Hello, Will. Very happy to be here.
Adrian, as we mentioned before, again, after reading your book, I have to say that it's so enlightening and also eye-opening for us to understand about the current leader of Xi Jinping. And I know within your book, this is something I mentioned in the intro, some people describe that Xi Jinping is not only the leader for China, but also this what we called miracle worker or even a god for the country. But on the other hand, in your book, you mentioned that Xi Jinping today, somehow it's untouchable. Now, help us to understand. The question is very simple. Is Xi Jinping really untouchable today? Not only for the people in China, but also outside China? And if so, in what way?
I mean, what Xi Jinping did is create very much a cult of personality around his own person. I mean, after my time in Hong Kong, as you mentioned, I lived for 10 years in mainland China, first in Shanghai and later many years in Beijing, there as a correspondent for German Stern magazine. And that was a time where also, of course, the Communist Party was a ruling party. It was not a liberal democratic country, not in that time, but it was quite liberal or quite free, let's say, compared to nowadays. And the leaders in that time, like Jiang Zemin and later Hu Jintao, may have seemed boring at that time, but that, when we are looking back, had been a quite a nice thing because they had been like officials who did that job as leading the country, while Xi Jinping and the people around him, but it cannot be done without the okay of Xi Jinping personally, decided that he wants to have a Mao-style cult around his personality.
Mm.
So why is he doing this? I mean, he's not a stupid person. I mean, as we describe in our biography, he is very clever in making his way. Of course, he had the advantage. He's a princeling. His father was the vice premier of the People's Republic. But still, I mean, there are a lot of princelings, and
Mm.
only one made the way to the top, and this is Xi Jinping. And he did this very strategically, so to say, for his own person, like going up the ladder from the village to the city, to a prefectura, to a province, and so on and so on. And so now, later, after he got his power, introducing this cult of personality was on purpose, because
Mm.
he thinks, that his strong belief, that like a liberal democracy, sometimes it's called Western democracy. So I don't like this word, because I mean it's not about geography. It's not the democracy or human rights. It also can be in South Korea or in Japan or in Australia, which are actually like far east from China. So it's not a question of east and west, but a question of values. And Xi Jinping thinks that these values wouldn't work for China. For him,
Mm.
as a communist believer, he saw the fall down of the Soviet Union. He saw the civil war in Yugoslavia. He saw the fall down of socialism in Eastern Europe, including East Germany. And he is very much afraid that the same thing could happen in China. And though he wants to make the Chinese people to strong believers, and he also obviously thinks that like Marxism, Leninism as an ideology is like too complicated for everybody to understand, or also people maybe won't believe it
Mm.
because they have seen that. In the past, like the countries who followed this idea had not been very successful economically. So he decides to use two important weapons. The one is, as we said, the cult around his personality.
Mm.
There's not a god in China because it's not a religious country, so they have to create their own god. Like in the past, the emperor was the god not only in China but also in Japan, for example, where the emperor was like a god to the people. So Xi Jinping made himself to his self-appointed god. And the other instrument he uses is nationalism, because
Mm.
unfortunately, I mean, that's not only in China. We have seen this in the United States with Donald Trump. We see this in Turkey. We see this in India. In many countries, that nationalism is a very strong instrument. Unfortunately, I, for instance, never have been a nationalist. For me, it never was important to be German or European or whatever. I think human beings are human
Mm.
beings. But you still can play this card very successfully if you say we are, in this case, Chinese, and the other countries, they are not very nice to us, so we have to unite. This always is very effective, and Xi Jinping understands this and uses it very much.
Adrian, before we bring international elements come into the conversation, again, I know at the beginning of the book that you actually wrote a whole chunk of content talking about the history of China. You know, again, under different presidents or under different rulers. But I want to be more specific. You know, back in the days that when we think about China, or excuse me, when we thought about China, or when we look at China through this mirror lenses, people tend to say that Chairman Mao helped the Chinese people to stand up. So in other words, to be independent. And then the successor is Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping opened the door for China to the world. But now today, fast forward for Xi Jinping, he has different political and also this economic agenda. Given the fact, again, keep in mind, there are 1.4 billion Chinese people, I think on everyone's mind today, there are three things that are very important. Number one, economy. And number two, social equality. And number three, international relations. And I don't just mean political relations between China with other countries. So going back to the point, or going back to your point, is how do you think that Xi Jinping was able to, or still able to accomplish or achieve three goals at the same time, or maybe 2 out of 3, or maybe 1 out of 3? So in other words, how do you think he prioritized those goals on his agenda in order to build his credibility? Because we know today that China is no longer just a name on the country. China is no longer just a colony used to belong to someone, but it's actually one of the major economic or political competitors with the rest of the world. How do you think Xi Jinping can prioritize his agenda so that his credibility will not be or should not be interfered or interrupted? What do you think?
You are absolutely right. I mean, China is now a very powerful country. The economy developed very well in the last decades, which is a very good thing because more than 800 million people had been lifted out of poverty. So that's a good thing. But one has to say, this is not thanks to the Communist Party. This did not start in 1949 with the victory of the revolution, which the Chinese call the liberation, the civil war, and the communists had been the winners. So, but this started in 1978 with Deng Xiaoping starting the policy of reform and opening up. And Xi Jinping, as we call him, in the title of our book, the most powerful man in the world, he is powerful thanks to that development, thanks to that reform and opening, which made China strong. So, but on the other hand, he is somehow going backwards, taking back some of the reforms and opening, like, I mean, he did not completely destroy the private sector. Of course, he knows that he needs a private sector, but still, I mean, he's very much controlling private companies, like we even have seen with famous examples like Jack Ma and so on. He increases the role of the Communist Party organizations, not only in the state-owned companies, but also in the private companies and in the joint ventures with foreign companies. And I mean, and this is the most significant point in these days, he used COVID-19 as a excuse to close off China from the outside world. China is now so isolated like it never had been since the Cultural Revolution. I mean, it's like for foreigners, if they are not long-term expats, it's nearly impossible to get to China in these days. And also for Chinese people, it's principally legally possible to leave the country, but the flight ticket's very expensive. You have to go weeks into a quarantine, so it's not very feasible for them. And I have a lot of Chinese friends here in Germany who haven't been in China since 2019, who haven't seen their family since 2019 because it's so difficult to travel. And this is, of course, officially explained by COVID-19. Of course, COVID-19 is a real existing pandemic and an illness. But I mean, most other countries of the world somehow have learned to live with it. And so I'm sure that for Xi Jinping. Of course, he's also afraid of there could be a lot of illnesses, cases, that people could be unhappy with him and with the Communist Party. But he has seen this also as a very convenient way to close off the country, which he, to some extent, wanted to do anyway. I mean, Deng Xiaoping said, when you open the window, also flies will come in.
That's right.
And but his meaning was, no problem about the flies. It's more important to have the open window to get the fresh air from outside, so to say. The approach of Xi Jinping is quite the opposite. He says, we have to close the window, otherwise the flies would come in.
You know, Adrian, I think it's interesting, again, because we're living at different periods, you know, from Chairman Mao to Deng Xiaoping to Hu Jintao and all the way to Xi Jinping. But you study Chinese history and you used to live in China, you know, for many years. You know that one thing that actually binds Chinese people together, it doesn't matter if you are a Communist Party leader or official or you're just average citizens. China, it's well known for telling stories. But what kind of stories? It's the story what we called from rags to riches. So in other words, we believe that through tenacity or through hard work, one person shall be successful in whatsoever. You know, again, you are able to build yourself up, you're able to accomplish or make your dream come true. And I think this is one of the backbones about China, or the backbones for Chinese people. But now fast forward, Xi Jinping is shaping the story today in a more, I want to be careful, in a more mild or in a more modest way. So in other words, even though look at his own background, his family, himself and his father also lived through this poverty, lived through the jeopardy, you know, this tough economic periods. But now today, look where China is and look where Xi Jinping is. How much do you think that today, for people to understand someone like Xi Jinping, who went through the tough moments, who went through the tough days, right now enjoy the glorious, enjoy the spotlight? Do you think that Xi Jinping today still want to tell the story about the good old days, or somehow we call it the tough days or the tough periods, so that Chinese people or even China today, it's able to stand strong or stand independently to go head to head with the competitors?
I mean, it's a good question because, of course, it's his intention to make China strong, and he talks a lot about the Chinese dream, which interestingly differs from the American dream, because the American dream is more like an individualistic dream.
That's right.
Which, by the way, is also a dream of Chinese people, because, as you pointed, China is so successful because people are very hard-working, very, very diligent, very ambitious. But they, of course, like anybody in the world, they are hardworking for themselves and for their families. And that's what I meant before when I said China's success started with reform and opening up, not with the Communist Party ruling the country, but vice versa, with the Communist Party giving the people the freedom to work for their own wealth and the wealth of their own family. This made them successful. And Xi Jinping, in his formula Chinese dream, he somehow tries to use this Chinese spirit, so to say, but put it more into the channel of like making the country as a country strong. And the problem with Xi Jinping is that, quite opposite compared to Deng Xiaoping, who was very pragmatic. He also was a convinced communist, but overall he was very pragmatic. Xi Jinping, he puts again, like under Mao, ideology higher than economic success. Of course, he also wants the economic success to make the country strong. But in questions of doubt, he decides for the ideology. Exactly the points we already mentioned. I mean, for the economy, it would be good, like to give the entrepreneurs the possibility to work successfully. But for political, ideological reasons, he does not want to have them too powerful, so he controls them, and so somehow disturbs their work. Economically, it would be the best to have the strong economic relations to the outside world. But for political, ideological reasons, he fears the influence of the outside world. So he somehow limits it in the last time with the excuse COVID, but still, I mean, if business people cannot travel, that's very much a limitation, and all like surveys like of the European Chamber of Commerce in China show that a lot of companies now who had been very happy to work in China in previous years, that they are saying now the surrounding is very difficult. So this is like a contradiction in Xi Jinping itself. So sometimes I'm saying the only person who can be dangerous for Xi Jinping is Xi Jinping, because on the one hand, he uses China's economic success to reach his goal, as he says, 2 centenaries. The first bring to all Chinese people moderate prosperity, like for the 100 years of Communist Party of China in the last year, and to make like China to the leading power economically, culturally, and so on in 2049 for the 100 years of the People's Republic of China. So he has this goal, and for this goal he needs a strong economy. But on the other hand, because he's so much focused on controlling everything, he is also a danger for this economy. And I mean, we are journalists, we are not fortune tellers, but it will be very interesting to see how this develops.
Adrian, I want to ask one more question before we move on to international stage. As you mentioned before, since 2020, the COVID-19 completely changed the whole world. So in other words, no one saw this pandemic coming. And right now today, fair to say that some parts of China today, or some major cities, are still battling against the pandemic. Now, initially, when the pandemic took place in China, it caused this what we called internal chaos. No one was prepared. No one was ready. But however, the strict lockdown, and again, even though some countries might disagree with it, but look at the result, it worked. But fast forward in the year of 2022, as we mentioned before, some cities and major cities in China today are still facing the strict lockdown, and people are very concerned and quite anxious about the result of the ongoing pandemic. My question, Adrian, to you is, how internally speaking, how much do you think the Chinese people today can trust the current leader? So in other words, we are looking at this person is going to declare his third-term presidency in less than 2 weeks. If this person has this strong desire, continue to lead the country of 1.4 billion people, credibility, strategy, empowerment. Those are the critical elements that Xi Jinping needs at this moment, in addition to economic shifts or economic policies. So going back to the question, how much do you think the Chinese people today can trust the Xi Jinping after battling the pandemic or in the midst of the whole pandemic and the COVID, zero COVID policy, the economic slowness, putting everything together? Where can Chinese people find hope and faith at this moment?
I mean, as you said, and we also write it in our book, it seemed for some time that China is dealing with COVID quite successfully in the times when there had been in the United States, in Europe, the cases were skyrocketing. The China could control this, and people even could live a normal life, which the people at that time could not live in many other countries. And of course, the Chinese propaganda, which of course always shows the positive sides, positive energy, even became like a slogan. So they use this very effective to show, oh, you see, our system is more effective. The whole world is suffering from this, and we have defeated this successfully. Okay, but if we look at the whole picture, we also have to see the beginning, that this illness only could spread because in the beginning, doctors who wanted to talk about it and who wanted to warn the people had been silenced.
That's right.
Even had invited to police stations and threatened, if you continue to talk about this, then you will get into difficulties. So it's always difficult to say what would have happened, but it's possible that if in Wuhan at that time immediately effective measures would have been taken and the lockdown there would have been earlier, that we would not have had a pandemic, possibly. And to see the whole picture, we also have to see what happens now, because so we see, okay, COVID has changed. The Omicron version of it, people much more easy can get it, but it's not so terrible like the first. For many people, it's really a little bit like the flu, or even less. I mean, I know many people, including myself, who had a positive test, but no symptoms at all. So, like a good governance would be to react flexible on this new situation, staying with the facts, seeking the truth in the facts, as it's said by Deng Xiaoping, what was even in ancient China, and say, okay, if the COVID has changed like this, first, we cannot stop it because we cannot prevent all the cases. We cannot have 0 cases, because that would mean to isolate the country forever. And we see even now the country is more or less isolated, but still there are cases in China. And so what happens now with very harsh lockdowns in Shanghai, in Chengdu, and other big cities, it's not motivated by medical reasons. I mean, there are also virologists in China itself who say, no, we should choose another path. It is, again, only motivated by political, ideological reasons. Why? Because Xi Jinping made the zero COVID to a part of his ideology. The only missing piece is that he did not put zero COVID into the constitution of the country and the constitution of the party. But in fact, it's now so connected with the person of Xi Jinping that these harsh lockdowns, they cannot be explained medically. I mean, even they harm the health of the people, because there had been, like in the Chinese internet, you could see a lot of cases of people who had like a heart infarct, or pregnant women who could not go to the hospitals because the negative test was missing. So this is not good for the health of the people. The local party organizations do this because this is how the Chinese system works. If they believe the Xi Jinping wants zero COVID, so they do this harsh zero COVID policy in their city or in their province, because they are afraid that if they do not do this, they get into difficulties, and because they hope if they do this very strict, they will be seen as very good followers of Xi Jinping and will be promoted. So this is completely politically motivated, and I think this harms China, and in this way even harms the own goal of Xi Jinping to make China even stronger.
Adrian, I want to bring our conversation to the international perspective. In 2016, in the US, as soon as Donald Trump appeared on the stage about to declare, well, to be the next president of the United States, everyone started to call this person as unconventional. So in other words, given his background, Donald Trump was not born into this political family, or was not into this politician type personality whatsoever. But somehow he was able to win the presidency and shoulder the responsibilities as the president. Now, people are also meanwhile describing or using the word unconventional for Xi Jinping. So in other words, Xi Jinping was handed over to the power by the predecessor regarding, as the president for the country. Now today, China, it's actually competing again with the rest of the world, politically speaking and also economically speaking. How much do you think that today people actually can believe that Xi Jinping is an unconventional leader if he's still considered as an unconventional leader or innovative leader? How should we interpret or understand the meaning of the words behind the meaning behind those words? So in other words, what does that mean when we say Xi Jinping is unconventional? Only in this international perspective, does that mean he's trying to elevate himself, or he's trying to elevate the status of China so that people can understand US and China are the two largest economies in the world, and also China today, it's heavily influencing others through the political power. What do you say?
I mean, in our book, we also make this comparison, Donald Trump and Xi Jinping, because they have some things in common. I mean, they both are from the elite. I mean, Trump as a rich businessman, and Xi Jinping as a princeling, as a son of leaders of the People's Republic. So his parents then fell in disgrace, but still, I mean, they. Before the Cultural Revolution, or before 1962, when his father came under house arrest, and after the death of Mao Zedong and the opening up, there had been high leaders. So both Xi Jinping and Trump are from the elite, but both made their brand, so to say, as fighters against the elite. So Donald Trump by opposing all this political correctness and all this discussion in intellectual circles, and Xi Jinping by his anti-corruption campaign, which made him on the one hand popular among Chinese people, or finally a strong man who is doing something against all these corrupt officials. But on the other hand, it was a very convenient way for him to get rid of all his competitors, or even of people who are not or haven't been competitors, but who might be competitors, because they are either now in prison, or they are afraid to get into prison, so they won't think twice before they, even not speaking about opposing Xi Jinping, but even if they say something, do something which Xi Jinping might not like. So, as you said, in this sense, like Xi Jinping is also an unconventional leader, like compared to Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, who had been quite, I used the word boring before. I mean, boring in the sense because they had been conventional. I mean, they did what was expected, what they would do, and like different from Xi Jinping. And such, let's also say, take the term charismatic persons are, of course, more interesting. It's more interesting to talk about them. They more easily get popular because they all have some populist, so to say, approach. But from history, I would say that these ambitious leaders always are very dangerous because they are unpredictable what they are doing. They can harm their country very much. I mean, like take the example of Donald Trump. He wanted to make America strong again, but actually, especially in the competition with China, he made the United States weaker because with all this craziness and telling the election results hadn't been true and doing these things on 6th of January and so on, he very much harmed the American democracy and made it very easy for the China's propaganda, for newspapers like Global Times and so on. Oh, you see, the American system, it's not working at all. And so he harmed the United States a lot, and same can happen with Xi Jinping to China. So he wants to make China strong again, but by doing crazy things like this is zero COVID now, or if he would attack military Taiwan or things like this, he would that would be big harm to China. Hong Kong, actually, where you're living, is an interesting example for both Trump and Xi Jinping. For Trump, because I mean, you know it better than I do, but there had been supposed to be the elections in Hong Kong, which, according to the polls, would have been a victory for the Democrats. And Donald Trump wrote a tweet saying, maybe we should, because of COVID, we should delay the US presidential elections for 1 year, which of course was ridiculous because that could not happen legally in the United States. But one day later, or a few days later, Hong Kong decided to delay the elections for 1 year, and they could very easily refer to Donald Trump. Right? Even in the United States, they discuss something like this. And also with his America First, which actually was not making America strong, but like America should not care about what happens in the outside world. He also made it very easy for the changes in Hong Kong with the security law and so on. On the other hand, Xi Jinping, I mean, I traveled a lot to Hong Kong also after 1997, and more or less I would have said it worked not so bad, both for Hong Kong and for China, because I mean, it was a special administrative zone in the People's Republic of China, but still, I mean, you could go, also Chinese tourists, for instance, mainland tourists, they could go to a bookstore in Hong Kong and buy a lot of interesting books that they couldn't buy in the People's Republic on the mainland. And let's face it, that didn't bring any big harm to the People's Republic. I mean, that was but by in fact destroying this model of one country, two systems in Hong Kong by Xi Jinping, because of his desire to control everything in detail and to be afraid of any kind of demonstration against the government and so on. By doing this, he destroyed for China the opportunity of a peaceful unification with Taiwan. If that model would have been successful in Hong Kong, there would have been a lot of people in Taiwan, not everybody, but from the election results, we can say like half of the population was quite open for closer relations to the mainland, to the People's Republic. But after what happened in Hong Kong, nobody in Taiwan, even the people who, for economic and other reasons, prefer the stronger relations to Taiwan, nobody wants to live under the leadership of the Communist Party and Xi Jinping. So he destroyed the possibility, Xi Jinping destroyed the possibility of peaceful unification, which would have been a great thing for China, and left only the possibility of unification by war, which would be a catastrophe for China and for the whole world.
Adrian, as you mentioned, again, we talk about your background. You were the Moscow correspondent of German Spiegel TV. You work as a correspondent, and you cover the military coup against the Gorbachev at the end of the Soviet Union, or which is the beginning of the new Russia. But right now, today, as we mentioned in the intro, the whole world continues to follow the war in Ukraine, which is very devastating. Even though some reports begin to show or begin to tell that the Ukrainian militaries are winning, but ultimately, at the end of the day, we have to agree with one another, war shall never be the solution to any problems, period. Now, let's talk about this relationship between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. Again, briefly, you live in China for many years, and you covered, regarding the military coup against the Gorbachev. From your perspective, what should we make of this relationship between Xi Jinping and Putin at this moment? And also keep in mind, not too long ago, Xi Jinping actually traveled internationally and met up with Vladimir Putin in person. That message was crystal clear, not only to the people in both countries, but also to the audience outside the world, which is the United States. So what do you think of the relationship? Is it pure personal? Is it diplomatic? Or there's something much deeper behind those two significant people?
There's something much deeper. Of course, also on the personal level, they match quite well, because both Putin and Xi Jinping are, as you said, like out of the box, unconventional leaders, and both think that their country was made bad experience with the outside world in the past, and that their historical greatness has to be restored. So this refers to very different periods, like in the Xi Jinping refers, of course, to the long ago colonial history, and we describe this also in our book, that of course terrible things there happened to China, and so this is an issue, of course. So one has to say that Xi Jinping is maybe a victim of his own propaganda, or of the education in mainland China, because there happened terrible things in much more recent time, like the great leap forward under Mao Zedong, with by estimations more than 50 million Chinese people who died from starvation. There had been the Cultural Revolution with also millions of victims. There had been 4th of June in 1989. So these are much more recent events than the colonial history, but like the in China already the children in school, they learn about the colonial history as if this would have been yesterday. But the things which happened more or less yesterday, they don't know anything about it, because they don't learn anything about it, neither in school and neither in the media and so on and so on. So anyway, this is what Xi Jinping is referring to, while Putin refers to more quite recent, like the fall down of the Soviet Union, big empire, and it fall down. And also, I mean, I've seen this, as you mentioned, I was a correspondent there for Spiegel TV in Moscow. I see the people were suffering. So I was not surprised that Putin was successful, because he said, yeah, we have to make ourselves strong again. And for some period, he also was successful. I mean, the situation in Russia became better compared to the Soviet time, or compared to the perestroika time, when there was a lot of chaos and turmoil. But back to your question, the relationship is much more deep than in these personal or also, let's say, ideological things. As they also declare openly, and as they declared literally in their joint declaration when Putin and Xi Jinping met for the opening of the Olympic Winter Games in Beijing, they want to change the world order. They want, I mean, as they put it, they think, yeah, the world is or was in the last decades very much dominated by the West, or especially the United States, and we want to change this to a more equal world order, which in itself is okay, I think. Yeah, I also don't want that one country has the hegemony over the world. So, but the background for them, Xi Jinping and Putin, saying this is more deep, because what do they mean by this, as they call it, Western hegemony? They are very much afraid, not so much of the foreign countries, as they put it, but of their own people. They are afraid that their own people, the Chinese people or the Russian people, might demand more liberties and more participation in the politics, decide about their own future. I mean, you can see this very good with the example of Ukraine. When Ukraine was, like Russia, very much I would say a half democratic country. They are more democratic than the People's Republic of China, of course, or at least had been in the last decades. But in mind, also with several multi-party system, but a lot of corruption, some kind of manipulation in the elections. There had been elections, but some kind of manipulations and so on. So some oligarchs, very rich oligarchs, who have a lot of influence on the politics. As long as Ukraine had this same system, so to say, as Russia, Putin didn't care about the borders between Russia and Ukraine and Crimea and so on and so on. He invaded the Crimea in 2014 after there was the, let's call it, democratic revolution in Ukraine. So he was, and is, very much afraid that if this is successful, same could come to China. Same to Russia, sorry. Same as Xi Jinping. I mean, as for Hong Kong, I think the main thing he's afraid of, not what happens inside of Hong Kong, but that what happens in Hong Kong could have been an example for the people in mainland China. So this is a deep connection between those two, Xi Jinping and Putin. They are, in fact, afraid of their own people. I mean, let's face it, the people in China as I've lived there and have a lot of Chinese friends and so on.
Mm.
I, in China, as a fact, I mean, like different from, let's say, the Soviet Union or the East Germany, they at least had fake elections. They
Mm.
every 4 years had elections which showed that 99.9% of the people supported the list proposed by the Communist Party, or like in East Germany, like in China, also this National Front. They have all this some small parties which are follow the lead of the Communist Party. So, and they always had this result that 99.9% of the people supported this. So, but at least for fake, they acknowledged that there should be some kind of elections and that one should accept this result of the elections. So they faked the election completely. But in the People's Republic of China, there are no elections. I mean,
Mm.
there is, of course, the People's Congress and the Consultative Conference, which the two sessions which gather every year. And it's told that the people there somehow are elected, but among all of my Chinese friends, colleagues, and so on, I don't know one person who ever was invited to such kind of elections for these delegates. So nobody knows how and by whom mysteriously these people are elected, and this is what Xi Jinping fears about Hong Kong and even more about Taiwan. That, I mean, this shows, I mean, this country is independent from the discussion about Taiwan independence or whatever. But I mean, as a matter of fact, Taiwan is a place which stays in the Chinese tradition, with the people speaking Mandarin and culturally stay in a Chinese tradition. And in fact, I have been to Taiwan several times. I mean, the Chinese traditions are much more preserved in Taiwan and also in Hong Kong than in the People's Republic of China, where a lot of like old temples or something are more like tourist places, not like real places of worship. So these are places in Chinese tradition, and still they have a functioning democracy. There's no reason why there should not be a democracy in China. And then some years ago, they started this kind of experiment to elect the village leaders. Okay, it's a good thing, but for a long time, I haven't heard anything about this experiment. And also, it's not quite logical, so to say, because I mean, when I discuss with like people who like defend Xi Jinping and the Chinese system and say, okay, we are such a big country and we have no other choice, we would have completely chaos if we would govern the country in a different way. They always refer to that China, in big part, in the countryside, it's not so much developed and the people are not so highly educated. And that's why we cannot have democracy like with different parties or competing candidates or whatsoever. But if this is the argument, why don't you take cities like Beijing and Shanghai, which are, without dispute, very high developed, which are in lots of things higher developed than many Western cities now, much more modern in using the digital means for everything and so on. Why don't you elect the mayor of Beijing or the mayor of Shanghai? I mean, that would be a good start. But they don't do it because they are afraid that this would be an example which would change the whole system.
Adrian, I think that during the conversation you brought up so many significant and meaningful points. But again, going back to your book, the book is entitled Xi Jinping, the most powerful man in the world. And I would like to wrap up our conversation with the same question that I ask every single distinguished author on my show. Adrian, what would you expect people to understand after reading your book? So, in other words, everyone knows, well, hopefully, by now, everyone should be able to understand who Xi Jinping is. But again, your book is called The Most Powerful Man in the World. What would you want readers to take away after reading your book?
Okay, I have two things here. I mean, the one, that's why we call it most powerful in the man in the world. I want the readers to understand that, especially the Western readers also, that the world very much has shifted. And I mean, if I look here in Germany or also in the United States and other countries, I mean, okay, like the people who are very much in politics and history, they know about the big role China plays in the world now. But if you ask people on the street, they would not know how high developed China is meanwhile. And because it is so important, and this is the second point, people simply should know who is Xi Jinping. I mean, we have here we have books about Donald Trump, Barack Obama without end. But the people, Xi Jinping is so important, not only for China, but for the world. And the people know very little about him. And maybe this is the last and third point, even like for Chinese people. Okay, there are many things in our books, like about Chinese history and so on, which are more directed to the Western readers, because we want them to understand not only who is Xi Jinping, but also who is China, and this needs a historical background. But also for the Chinese people, I mean, they know Xi Jinping, they see Xi Jinping every day through the propaganda. But in our research, we found a lot of things, for example, about the personal life of Xi Jinping, which I think are not familiar to the most Chinese people, starting with something, it's not important, no problem, but I mean, with his first marriage, and actually his second wife, this is like a taboo in China, but even also going to more important political things that, like Xi Jinping, his father, was quite liberal, had meetings with the Dalai Lama, which would be impossible to think today. But also the details, what happened to Xi Jinping during the Cultural Revolution and to his family, that his sister committed suicide as a victim of the Cultural Revolution, that he himself was in prison for some months and so on. But why he still became such a strong communist believer. I mean, these are a lot of interesting details about the life of Xi Jinping, which I think are interesting to know for all the people, Chinese, and but also, of course, people all over the world.
Well, Adrian, after having the conversation with you, it surely again motivated me to read your book for the second time, or perhaps even for the third time. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I am speaking to Mr. Adrian Geiges. And again, Adrian works as the Moscow correspondent of the German Spiegel TV, covered the military coup against Gorbachev, the end of the Soviet Union, and the beginning of the new Russia. And in 1997, he lived in Hong Kong to report about the handover of the city to China. Of course, that today we're having the conversation with Adrian regarding his new book, and should I say one of the most interesting and meaningful books that he's written, and which is entitled Xi Jinping, the Most Powerful Man in the World. Adrian, thank you so much for taking your time to be on the show. Again, I strongly encourage everyone to grab a copy of his book, really dive into to understand about China and understand about this leader and the future of the country. Adrian, thank you so much for doing this.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you for the very, very interesting conversation and the great questions.